Good afternoon, everybody. This is the next session for 115. We're talking about whether or not virtual reality can take the place of teachers in the future and whether or not virtual reality can ultimately become a super teacher. I'm Paul Turnbull. I'm the president of Mid-Pacific Institute, which is a preschool through 12th grade private school in Honolulu, Hawaii. I'll be moderating this particular talk. And what I'd like to do is introduce, or have the panelists introduce themselves. Then we'll go through a fairly fluid conversation about specific topics related to whether or not virtual reality can become a super teacher in the future. And then we'll open it up for questions in just a few minutes as well. So, Jolene, would you like to start us off?
I am Jolene Creighton. I'm the founding editor of a website called Futurism. We write about artificial intelligence, gene editing, and basically things that are somehow impacting our future. So not so much gadgets like the new iPhone, but more things that pose an existential threat, and just our future society in general, so like automation and job loss. In addition to my work at Futurism, I also spent 4 or 5 years teaching at the university level while I was working on my PhD, which focuses on how individuals and organizations communicate science. So this seems particularly relevant, not only because my life is dedicated to the communication of science and tech, but I also have spent several years as a teacher.
Awesome. Luke?
Hi, my name is Luke Dormehl. I'm a technology journalist. I've written for a number of publications, Wired, The Guardian, The Economist, a few others, and my most recent book is Thinking Machines, which is a history of artificial intelligence.
He didn't write for Futurism yet.
And I'm Robyn Vierra. I also come from Honolulu, Hawaii, but a different school, Punahou School. And I am one of the directors of our Center for Global Learning, and I work to help realize one of the Punahou aims of globally competent students. And as part of that, we use VR to connect students to different people and places. And I also work in Johns Hopkins School of Education.
So we start looking at whether or not virtual reality as an entity that we know about today, and we're learning about it because the space is growing rapidly, can become a teacher. Can a thing become a teacher? So today's conversation is about whether or not we believe there's an intersection that is viable for the future. When we started looking at the potentials of this conversation, and I was talking to the panelists beforehand, 3 main categories rose to the fore. The first one is personalized learning, and we've heard a lot about the ability or potential for technology to really bring personalized learning to a whole new level. We also talked about the art and science of teaching, and then of course, because we're talking about virtual reality and its unknowns, we're talking about potentially the cautions that we should put in place before we sort of wade into the wild blue yonder. So having said all of those things, we're going to dive right in. On the topic of personalized learning, I want to hear from the panel. First of all, before I set a prompt out, I'm interested in what kind of personalized learning you're familiar with right now, if you're already using it, or if there are individuals that are consistently asking you questions. You know, why can't VR do this?
I'll speak first on personalized learning because we use it a lot in education. It's the idea that students pursue their personal passions, they go down their own areas of inquiry, and they're learning at their own differentiated skill level. So, what was the second part of your question? Just how we use it?
If you're using virtual reality to improve or somehow better the idea of personalized learning.
Right. So I wouldn't say we're actually doing it yet. In some sense, sometimes we use virtual reality to launch perhaps the design thinking cycle, which supports personalized learning. You know, maybe I have students, they're in a Syrian refugee camp, and then they generate, that's very generative of questions they might have about the Syrian refugee crisis. And then they might prototype some ideas to solve that. And it does kind of lead them on a personalized journey, and they present solutions. But it's really just another tool that supports their learning. I do see it in the future, it being a greater part of personalized learning, perhaps. You know, one of the hardest obstacles for teachers to personalize learning is just the management of it. Beyond the standardization of education, managing this student's gonna do a makery project and this student's gonna do a science lab is tremendously taxing on teachers. So I can see the future of personalized learning and education, perhaps one student's doing an ocean acidification lab in VR, where another student's building contraptions on Contraption Maker that might allow them to personalize their education in a way that is logistically challenging in the classroom.
And for my own part, so I taught at the university level. Specifically, I taught classes on literature, rhetoric, communication. And unfortunately, the humanities is one of the areas that's been extremely, extremely hard to benefit from technology when it comes to grading. So I had, any given semester, 60 to 90 papers that I had to read for every single assignment that I did. Assuming I spend an hour on a paper, that's just a massive amount of time. So what I'm getting at is, unfortunately, personalized learning really didn't make it into my classroom in any super meaningful way. I would try and do things like, for the final projects, allow students to do a number of different things depending upon what the class was. So, for example, world literature, perhaps they would write a poem or a play and talk about how theirs is speaking to a similar topic that another story we read or poem we read during the semester is speaking to. But really, it's kind of one size fits all currently.
Sure, and I'm not involved with I'm not sort of working within the education sector. So for me, when I think about personalization at the moment and how that impacts me in terms of technology, it would probably be less about VR and more about artificial intelligence and the idea of sort of algorithms that present us with personalized information. So I suppose most people here are familiar with, it's often called sort of the filter bubble effect, or the fact that for years now, Google, for example, if you and I search for the same query, we'll get different results. We'll get results based on what Google thinks that we'll be interested in, and that's a similar thing to what we see maybe on sort of Amazon, where you buy a book and it says, you enjoyed this, you may also enjoy these books. So, and that's something which has been, I suppose, all of the large kind of tech companies are incorporating these sort of machine learning tools to engender personalization and to make that possible. But I think it would be really interesting if we were able to take some of those tools and use them in a sort of an educational context in order to sort of apply those to maybe sort of personalizing curricula, or sort of more specifically sort of personalizing the learning experience for people so that it's done in a way that's going to, I suppose, benefit both the student and the teacher.
Right. Let's explore that a little bit more. So Todd Rose, who's a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, talks about the tyranny, how does he put it? The hidden tyranny of average. And the explanation behind average is that ultimately each one of us in the audience and those of us on the panel, we each have a different set of styles of learning and a set of styles of communication and a set of styles for interpersonal relationships. If the hypothesis is that teachers are taught to teach to the average, and that the majority of time then goes to the folks who are below average because they need more time on task, perhaps, and the students who are at the top receive less time because they're assumed to be fine all by themselves. The question then becomes, does anything really get done? Is average really something that helps anybody? So, playing on what you were just talking about, Luke, I'm interested in sort of the dream. So let's go beyond the reality of where we are today, that VR is a predominantly consumer or consumption-based thing. There aren't a lot of content creation aspects right now. But thinking about the dream, what potentially could we do to reverse the trend of the hidden tyranny of average? How could you have this jagged profile, perhaps, that applies to every single student, and we know what their learning styles are? And how do we bring those things together? Yeah,
so I just want to jump way ahead to the future, because I don't think this is something we're going to see in the next couple of years. But before I do, I also want to point out that this tyranny of the average, it doesn't just impact or hurt students who perhaps don't perform as well because they either get left behind because we're teaching to the average, or it kind of maybe like draws uncomfortable attention to them because a teacher spends more time with them. It also harms students who overperform or who perhaps are more advanced, whatever term you want to use, because I have friends who would get terribly bored at school and not pay attention, and then they would get bad grades because just they would be ahead of maybe where the average in the class was. So it's just really, it is very harmful teaching in this way to the average. So what I would like to see is a future in which, for example, we are able to use VR devices. So say like you actually have headsets the students are using. I was talking with this right before the panel with Luke. And students are exploring Pompeii for a history lesson. If you incorporate machine learning, which basically is a technology that allows computers and systems to make sense of data, analyze data very, very fast, and then make meaning from that. So say a student is exploring a VR environment, Pompeii, and the machine learning tech, it can read the body signals, it can see and understand how the student is responding, and ultimately determine what is interesting to that student, and then provide more of that information. So perhaps their eyes are focused on a specific area, perhaps their heart rate increases, and they get excited when they hear something or they see something. Machine learning and VR, AI and VR together, can make meaning from all of those signals that the student is giving off and perhaps show different aspects of Pompeii or give more information, explicate things further. And I think that that's ultimately where I would like to see this at least start to go. And I think that's one potential application for virtual reality in the future. Because a teacher can't do that. They can't read a student and understand what's really interesting to them. And they certainly can't read a classroom full of 30 or 40 students. But with body tracking tech, with virtual reality, with artificial intelligence, all of these things coming together, I think are what ultimately really create the super teacher, not one thing by itself.
Yeah, no, to be honest, I was just thinking about, based on my own sort of face while I was trying out the various virtual reality demos, kind of what that would sort of say about I think it would just be a sort of a perpetual kind of Keanu Reeves kind of whoa sort of reaction. But yeah, I completely agree with that. And again, I think the exciting thing about a lot of these personalization tools is that they don't just exist within one sphere of technology. So kind of the VR example is great, but for example, I've spoken with a lot of startups who are doing, or companies who are doing some really interesting work with using algorithms to generate text. So for example, I know that a lot of newspapers at a time of sort of media, I guess is going through a bit of a kind of a crisis in terms of how do you sort of get people to continue sort of reading maybe traditional news outlets. And a lot of companies are interested in the idea of could you use these same sort of personalization tools to make news stories customized to the reader, which I think is interesting. At the moment, we sort of have a sort of a situation where you may be recommended news stories that algorithms think will appeal to you, but the news story itself will look the same depending on whether you read it or someone else reads it. The idea that you would be able to, for example, analyze, I mean, there are lots of ways that you would be able to sort of determine someone's response to something based on, whether, I suppose, the kind of things that they're reading, the amount of time that they spend reading a page, whether or not they finish reading an article. There are lots of, you mentioned sort of various kind of biometric technologies that you could use. And I think that's exciting, so that you could, for example, have a student who maybe responds to data in a kind of a more sort of, maybe a more sort of image-based way, or, or perhaps they, as you say, they're particularly engaged with one aspect of a module, and you would then be able to kind of highlight those particular kind of aspects of it. So I think that's the exciting thing about these personalization tools, is that they don't just exist within one sector of technology. You really can apply them to all sorts of things. So I think the VR example is great, because that conflation of VR and artificial intelligence isn't necessarily the first, that they're not terms that you would always connect, but I think that's a great example of how they could connect in a way that could genuinely be really kind of transformative in the classroom.
Robyn, are we talking about the teacher changing in terms of role and presence in the classroom entirely? Is this really the VR super teacher, or are we talking about a different method of creating curriculum and deliverables?
I think the idea of the VR SuperTeacher can be kind of scary. The idea that perhaps we're all going to be out of work, where to me it sounds exciting, because to me it's taking away a lot of the work that gets in the way of us doing some of the really great things that teachers do, is connecting with students, building relationships, coaching, giving really thoughtful feedback, building some of those social, emotional skills, interpersonal learning. And it takes away a lot of that management aspect of needing to set something up, needing to analyze the data on where they stood. The program is adaptive probably in and of itself. So I see it as a tool. Another, the way I visualize the future classroom is much like many schools are moving towards a learning commons, where kids are going in different directions. They're in the VR. They're looking at a book. They're working on their laptop. They're meeting with a teacher, and these are all tools around for them that are supporting their personalized inquiries and their personalized interests. And so for me, it's exciting that I can do the things that I think really great teachers do and sometimes don't have the time to do.
I also think that, because obviously futurism, we're always talking about the future, there's sort of a limitus there on how far into the future you can go. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I'm sure most of you have heard of, is very much against predictions. Because most often they're wrong. And so I think that it's important to note during this conversation that there are certain things we can anticipate. But when it comes to things like getting rid of teachers completely, if that happens, that's something I think it's in the far future. It's not something that, dealing with this tech on a day-to-day basis, it goes forward in small increments, as does science. So I think most immediately that we're going to start to see these applications come into the classroom, and teachers are very much going to be a part of student learning for, the short to midterm at least. And then far term, maybe things will change substantially, but I also am not sure how much we really can say, and it makes sense to think about those things, but I also don't think we should put too much weight or concern on them.
Sure, yeah, I would agree. One of my favorite stories about people trying to kind of predict the future was that there was a conference in Boston back in the 70s, and there was an AI professor who was making really, really specific sort of predictions about when things would happen. He was sort of saying, in 1987 we'll have robots that pick up our socks, and in 1992... And afterwards, a younger colleague kind of ran up to him and said, please stop making these predictions. They never kind of pan out, and we always look really bad. And he said, oh, that's fine. All of the predictions were after I'd retired. And so I kind of think that that's the problem with a lot of these predictions. But, yeah, I think that what you're saying is kind of optimistic, though, because I think a lot of us would be, there are all these terrifying statistics about what automation's going to do in terms of employment. There have been, most studies seem to sort of peg, there was a famous 2013 study, and most other studies have sort of replicated the results, suggesting that about 47% of currently existing jobs could be automated maybe within the next kind of couple of decades. But I like the idea that maybe in the short term, rather than sort of, I don't think we want to dream of a world where we're getting rid of teachers and we're saying what a teacher does can be reduced to, sort of data processing or something like that. I think teachers play an incredibly valuable role. But maybe in the short term, what's exciting is the idea of using something like, we all have these tools like Siri or Google Assistant on our phones, these kind of AI smart assistants. So maybe we could sort of have the smart TA, we could kind of have the sort of the AI teaching assistant, which I think is maybe a more valuable way to think about it, and a less scary way than sort of the idea of the virtual teacher as the sort of hovering, avatar like that terrible Microsoft Clippy paperclip in the corner of our screens.
I'll just add one last quick thought to that, is that, when you talk about the automation of jobs, that means a lot of people are out of jobs, and we need to think about how are we going to re-educate these people for new jobs. And to be honest, we don't have the capacity in today's structure to be able to do that. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to re-educate a whole workforce around their personal interests and what they might do next.
So I'd actually like to explore that a little bit. So we talked a little bit about the idea of the teacher as the interpersonal, interrelational individual. We have to make value judgments for students who may be ahead of the curve or behind the curve or interested in something that the curriculum isn't covering at the moment. And I want to stick a pin on that and come back to it. I want to talk a little bit about what you're talking about in terms of the classroom, and if it's a machine-driven classroom that is so smart one day, and we'll figure out, I don't know who among us is the youngest, but let's figure out when we're going to retire, and we'll make predictions for after we retire. So 2195, how about that? If there's an environment that could be created, this is total just blue sky thinking, that is the best part of the App Store, the best part of Amazon, the best part of eBay, and it is adaptive and not reactive. And how does, to Robyn's point, and then what we were talking about as well, how does an environment like that allow teachers to really become guides and coaches rather than a stand and deliver model where each student is a vessel to be filled, and then we measure that student on a yes or no basis. Are you smart? Are you capable? Will you be successful? So what would go into a technological environment that builds something that is that adaptive? I mean, I'm looking at our two sort of machine learning AI futurist folks, because you were mind-blowing all in your own. So
what would we need to like make something like that, or?
Yeah. What would go into that,
Oh,
and
gosh.
then apply? Like, how long from now are we really talking?
Okay, all right. So I'd say before I really start seeing something like that, this is going to be before I retire. So this is not awesome for me. Gosh. I mean, it's the problem with trying to do this, though, is that AI is so early. So I was at the World Government Summit last month. It was also held in Dubai. And I went to a closed-door roundtable that had heads from IBM Watson, heads from Facebook's AI and policy, heads from IEEE, all of like the top innovators and government leaders who are working on AI policy there, talking about how do we govern artificial intelligence, how do we make it moral and ethical, what is the timeline on this stuff? And their answer was, we don't know, because AI is in its most nascent stages. This industry is remarkably young. And I would say the exact same thing about virtual reality. So if I had to throw something on it, when we start like realizing this stuff, gosh, maybe past 2030 or something like that. I mean, we also have so many economic issues to overcome. But it would require so much work. I mean, we don't understand next to anything about neuroscience and the human brain. About human biology. There are so many things that we would have to figure out, not only as far as the technology goes, but as far as our own biology goes, before we can start doing that. Which is why I think it's not in the next 5 years that we're going to be throwing students into these virtual worlds and having teachers step back. I think that's why I say short to midterm, we're dealing with more smaller scale stuff, but truly like superpowered AI, virtual teachers and stuff like that, I think is more long term.
Sure, yeah, I guess a couple of kind of points. One of them is, I suppose, the social aspect of this. A lot of the time, technology is kind of what we can do technologically is maybe ahead of where we are as a society in terms of wanting to adopt these tools. So I'll kind of give you an example. I interviewed a professor at a Chinese university a couple of years ago, and he'd set up what started as kind of a simple system in his classroom. He was teaching a large class, and people were sort of partially graded on whether they turned up or not. So he set up a webcam and basically started kind of filming the class to use facial recognition as a sort of, just to tick people off the register afterwards to make sure they'd attended. And then he started sort of saying, oh, well, you could delve into this data a little bit more. You could start building a simple kind of AI that would be able to tell me, what proportion of the class are smiling at a certain time. When do people start looking kind of bored? We could start kind of grouping people to see where they sit and whether we could move them around to kind of, sort of spread out the smart people maybe throughout the class and see if that has any kind of effect. And the interesting thing is, from a technology point of view, a lot of that's kind of pretty cool. But at the same time, maybe as parents, you may be a little bit worried if you suddenly hear that your child's teacher is in a class where they're using sort of facial recognition to kind of, sort of read emotions into things. I think a lot of this is kind of, I think these will shift over time. Our sort of, if you think about sort of, our responses to maybe being, so maybe something like anonymity on the internet. If you look back in sort of the early 90s when people were starting to use the internet, everyone sort of believed they were completely anonymous. Now we kind of accept the fact, we have smart speakers in our homes which are basically hearing what we say and then feeding it back to us as ads. So we do sort of shift over time. But I think that when you're talking about these sorts of technologies, it's often important people can often leave out that sort of societal aspect and sort of what are we comfortable as a society incorporating into the classroom as well as what's possible. And then the one other thing I just think is interesting is when we talk about the kind of the classroom of the future, I think one of the things that's most exciting in some ways, I mean, I was fortunate. I went to a good school. I had sort of, reasonable kind of class sizes. I think the exciting opportunities here are often that the classroom of the future what it may look for people who don't currently have the opportunity to kind of, learn in those kind of sort of situations, I suppose. So the idea that you could maybe have one great teacher who's able to extend the reach of their teaching to much broader kind of audience of people who maybe don't have educational opportunities, who are getting their first smartphones and are suddenly kind of connected to the internet. I think that's kind of an exciting idea. The fact that the classroom doesn't have to be a sort of a physical classroom anymore.
Right, access and reach becomes an entirely different thing. Rob?
You talked about what are we willing to accept as a society, and I think when we're talking about this utopian world where we might be using AI and VR, I think we also have to think as experts in education, what are we willing to accept in terms of educating our children? And when we look at what that future might look like, I don't know. I really don't know, but I think it's important that us as educators, we drive that conversation and we don't wait for the technology industry to drop a new technology on us and for us to figure out how we want to use it, if we do or we don't. But it's important for us to stand up and drive some of those conversations about what do we need. I'm thinking, okay, I work in global education, and I'm just listening to you. I'm like, okay, what would I want? What would I dream about having? And I teach cross-cultural communication. So what if someone was in a VR and there's someone somewhere else in the world and they're having a conversation, and the AI could kind of pick up on maybe something you did, maybe the way you said no, and then someone in a different culture is like, oh, like you might. It felt rude in some sense and it can give the student that feedback on the way that their communication style might not translate across cultures. So that's just sort of me dreaming about what might be a tool to teach cross-cultural communication, but I think it's important that we all dream about what we want for our students.
And that's a good segue. So at Mid-Pacific, for example, our school has an immersive technology program. It's in its second year. Generally speaking, we have about 500 students a year who use virtual reality, either for content consumption or creation, 360 video for VR, animation, game design, and all the way up through LiDAR scanning. So what we hear are the students coming back to us saying, these experiences from a consumption basis, virtual field trips, are really cool, but I want so much more. And can you actually do this other thing that's more important to me than perhaps this piece of European history? Can we go deeper in another area? How do we translate that into something that, Jolene, that you said? You talked about moral intelligence. There's emotional intelligence. If we take the idea that it's more about the heart than the head, or can AI replace the head? If it's about the heart, and there's emotional intelligence that people talk about right now, but there's moral intelligence, which is the antecedent to some mistakes that we might make. If we're listening to the students, like you're saying, Robyn, what are the questions that we should be asking, and what are the cautions that we should be putting out there before we tread too deeply into this?
So I'm not sure if this really answers the question, but one of the things that I was thinking about a lot in anticipation of this panel was kind of what Luke was saying about the face tracking technology. If, for example, let's take a literature class, you're in virtual reality watching Romeo and Juliet or some other play by Shakespeare, or you're just going through a series of plays or something like that, and you have machine learning or artificial intelligence that is tracking how students respond to particular texts. What their emotional response is, whether or not they have emotional response, which makes sense. We'd want that information. If a particular text is recurrently making students bored, then maybe we want to drop that text. But I think the primary question that we need to ask there is, what are students' rights? If we know that objectively a technology is going to make a student a better human or a better citizen at the end of it all, does that mean that we have a right to use this information, to see the emotions that they aren't expressing verbally, that they aren't telling us? And I obviously don't have the answer to that, but that's something we need to seriously think about. Because what we saw with previous disruptions, the Industrial Revolution, for example, is that the problems came and then we tried to deal with the problems. I think that we are beyond the point because of the just revolutionary nature of these disruptions caused by the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We can't wait for the problems and then try and fix them. We're talking about students' rights. This is a very important thing. And so I think that's something that we as educators and policymakers need to start thinking about very seriously, far more seriously than we do now.
I was just interested, I apologize, this is going to be another question that doesn't really answer the question, but when you're talking about the kind of the emotional reaction, are we ever going to reach a point where you don't just get, you know how in English you're kind of analyzing a book? Is there going to be a point at which you're graded based on your emotional reaction to the book? Because I remember clearly reading kind of, a lot of classics at school and really kind of not liking them and not getting them and, obviously kind of faking it for the exam and being, Test of the D'Urbervilles, great book. And, you'd waited like halfway through and you'd watched the last half of the film adaptation and maybe kind of at one point is there going to be a kind of, we can see from your emotional tracking that your biometrics show that you're lying about this.
Or like you were not actually paying attention. I mean, you could be in a VR environment watching this poem or play or whatever it is and just completely distracted in your own world of thinking of something else. No, you're totally right. So would you get demerits for being like distracted and not paying attention?
But I do think that there is a genuine sort of question to be asked about that in terms of concerns. There's a startup called Coursera, which does smart textbooks. And the idea there is that the teacher is able to, most textbooks traditionally kind of teachers give some learning to be sort of done outside the class, and they kind of hope that the students do it, and then they kind of learn later through maybe tests or something like that to see whether or not they actually have read what they say that they're going to read. With smart textbooks now, you can see how long students have spent reading particular books. Have they kind of skipped over a bunch of pages really rapidly? They can do very similar things with Kindle in terms of, sort of how much people are engaging with the books that they're reading. So. And when I first heard about that, I sort of had that reaction where I'm like, this is kind of cool, but that's also sort of creepy, isn't it? So it's difficult because it really is extending the reach of the teacher outside the classroom. And I think in a lot of ways that's great when it comes to kind of, opening up opportunities and breaking down barriers. But I do think that a lot of these things, there is a kind of a sort of surveillance creepiness to it that is kind of interesting to explore. And I think you're right, we need to be having those sorts of conversations because these technologies are only getting smarter, so we need to address them at this point to kind of work out how people are responding to them, because before we know it, these are going to become just a standard part of our lives, and maybe will be sort of non-questioned as a result of that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I have a lot of cautionary questions around it. Two, maybe I'll think about, we talk about AI being able to read student frustration level. If they've reached some sort of struggle point, then it can be adaptive to that. But at the same time, I also wonder, well, we know productive struggle's important, and we know it builds some of those skills around grit and resilience and creative problem solving, that if we are that adaptive to frustration, what are we teaching students? And then my other cautionary question is, when we talk about personalizing, that a student looks at this direction in Pompeii, I'm just thinking, and then it starts curating resources for them, well, then is that still personalization? Because it's still somebody else curating your path, where the whole idea behind personalization is that it's student directed. It's students making empowered choices about what they want to learn. And so my cautionary question is that we don't take away student empowerment, and we don't take away student struggle.
Right, so we essentially move from the teacher knowing all or the publishers knowing all to the students asking all.
Yeah.
And then we have the resources available for those students to explore those questions, and in the best case scenario, we get out of the way, right, as adults. So we've gone through a fairly large discussion on a number of points. I'd like to open it up to the audience. If anybody has any questions, our panel is incredibly intelligent, way smarter than I am, so feel free.
Come on, someone.
This is what we call teacher wait time.
Yeah. That uncomfortable
That's
time.
right.
We're doing emotional analysis on all of you.
Right, maybe AI could see if someone was formulating a question and was too nervous to ask it, but they had something in their head. That might be interesting.
Mm-hmm. While you're thinking of your questions out there, so we've really talked about a number of things, and we've touched on these things in terms of the teacher as coach, right? So we're getting away from this teacher-driven model to a student-driven model, and the question remains, does the student-driven model actually become a curated, aggregator, machine-driven model telling the students what to ask? And we don't have that answer, but it's a sort of a formulating question that's out there. Would you, as a panel, agree? We also agree that sort of that curated aggregator store of sorts is too far out, right, for us to predict. We don't say that 2030 we're going to be walking into these virtual environments.
Yeah, I think it's a bit too far out to predict. I also really like and agree with that point, that we don't want to move from just adults making all the choices, tyranny of the average, here's what you get, to then machines making all the choices, telling students what they need. At the same time, though, most AI researchers that I have spoken to say that when we realize true artificial intelligence, because AlphaGo, that thing that beat all the world record holders at Go, the top players, it's not really intelligent. It's able to process data very, very fast, but it's not really intelligent. We don't actually have artificial intelligence yet. And most AI researchers that I've spoken to say that when we do, it's going to be beyond anything that we can possibly imagine. It's going to be a synthetic form of intelligence. It's going to be fundamentally different than our own type of intelligence. So at that point, I suppose one question we might be faced with is, if it really knows better, if it really knows better than teachers, than students, if it's really that intelligent, maybe we should just say, all right, machine, you take over, you teach our students. But that's, again, I think, really far off. It's not something that we're going to have to contend with in the mid to short term.
Mm-hmm.
The question to me, though, is if a machine can teach it, maybe a machine should just do it, and we should do something that humans can do. I don't know. That's just a question it raises for me.
Yeah, no, and precisely. And I think that's the reason it's so difficult to talk about that is because we don't know what the machine is good at and where those holes are because the technology hasn't been realized yet. It's not here. So all the dooms people and the naysayers and stuff like that, I think it makes far more sense to deal with the problems that are facing us now and to sort of think about the future, but really those super far off things that are, the technology is not here. How can we possibly answer those questions? Mm-hmm. Is it how teachers can be best utilized? But I think that, when the time comes, we'll figure that out.
Yeah, I again think it comes... Is this microphone still... Yeah, sorry. We were given very, very specific instructions beforehand about exactly how far we should hold this away from our mouths. And I'm only now at this point in the talk realizing why those instructions were given. But again, I kind of think that it comes back to this question of we're not necessarily building machine. We're not looking at human teachers and saying, wouldn't it be great if they could be replaced by a person on a screen? The current teachers, that's a completely flawed model. Robots would be able to do it much better. I think that we're not yet at the point. It's arguable whether we're ever going to get to the point whether it's going to be possible to kind of replicate human intelligence or an approximation of that within machines, partially because we still don't really know what intelligence is, and we sort of always talk about technology we talk about intelligence as being kind of one metric, but of course intelligence kind of breaks down into all sorts of different areas. But I think that what's interesting about these things and why it's sometimes sort of a misnomer to kind of look long term, is because there are lots of things that AI can currently do, which is I suppose, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of complementary to what humans can do. And I think in a lot of cases, you know, from having friends who are sort of teachers and seeing how kind of overworked they are, there are certainly areas that teachers could do where teachers could be better utilizing their resources right now. And these are things that machines are very capable of doing right at this moment. So I think that that's kind of how we should be looking at things. We should be saying that there are some great kind of traits like sort of human creativity and human ingenuity. And yeah, there are some questions being asked about, you know, machines. I think that they can be creative on a level, but I think that these are sorts of traits which humans excel at. And then maybe some of the kind of the data crunching parts of what it is that we do, machines can often do a lot better than we can. So we should be looking not necessarily at the long-term idea of replacing humans, but at the short-term, how do we sort of sit existing teachers alongside machine intelligence, and how do we kind of make that a sort of symbiotic kind of complementary relationship?
Yeah, and I also think it's a really important point that you made, which is that's an assumption that we have, that most people have, is that we will realize true artificial intelligence. We may not. That might be something that is actually beyond our grasp. We may not be able to replicate, you know, human intelligence or any type of meaningful intelligence.
I just totally agree that it can complement what a teacher's doing. You know, I think about when I was in the classroom, how challenging it was to do a running record on a student and assess their reading level. That would inform how I might differentiate and personalize their reading instruction. And if an AI VR machine could assess a student's reading level, understand where their frustration level is with it, crunch all that data of like, okay, they're not getting the ch sound or whatever, and just hand it to me so that then I can differentiate and personalize their reading instruction, that is huge. That saves that teacher hours of time, and it can be a tremendous teaching tool.
So we've got just a few minutes left. Short answers. How does this question, or how does this topic change if we move from teachers and students to teachers and teachers? Does this change if we're talking about the way we train teachers?
I mean, I think that, again, not sure if this is really answering the question, but we already have online learning classes. If we could have, take the best of teachers around the world, the lessons that they have, because we all have different lesson plans that we utilize, and bring them together, I think that could greatly assist young teachers who are just starting out. I also do think, because it's already raising issues, all these online courses, with copyright's probably not the right term, but there are issues with teachers stealing other teachers' classes. And so again, we just need to be forward thinking about that.
Intellectual property.
Intellectual property, yes, precisely.
Yeah.
I tend to think that like people in any industry, it's important just to kind of keep up with where technology is right now. And particularly, I suppose, if you're a teacher, you're going to be working with young people. Young people are always going to know more about breaking technology, as in sort of, I suppose, yeah, kind of currently breaking technology, than people who are going to be sort of maybe older. So kind of keeping up with where those kind of trends are going, the kind of the ethical debates around them, what it is that people find useful in terms of learning, that's kind of a useful thing. I would say, again, that's a kind of a general attitude to the fact that everyone should be finding out about these sorts of technological questions and how they relate to their own professions. But certainly I think that that would be very applicable in a field like teaching, where you're working with lots of young people.
Mm-hmm.
The type of teacher we're looking for now is changing, and that informs teacher training. We're looking for teachers who are not content experts, perhaps, or at least hopefully we're not. We're looking for someone a little bit more agile, a little bit more receptive to where a student's at. And if we're training agile teachers who can adapt to different learning environments, then, I mean, absolutely, the teacher training will change, and it should be changing, because the role of the teacher has changed, and VR and AI is just supporting that.
Fantastic. So we've covered a lot of ground. I want to thank all the panelists, Jolene, Creighton, Dormehl, and Robyn Vierra for their incredible insights and predictions. Would you please help me welcome them? Or thank you.